So let me just get started right away because of the time limitations. So just to give you an overview of my talk, I'll be talking about the importance and the process for developing a strategic focus area. Then I'll talk about the process of need exploration, how one performs interviews, how we can observe procedures, and how we can generate a need statement, and then how we can screen these need statements based on the clinical aspects, the analysis of existing solutions, the stakeholders, and the market analysis, and ultimately, how do we select these based on these various criteria that we've established. So regarding a strategic focus, let me start off with this quote. Sorry, I just want to have my icon somewhere here. Okay. So deciding what not to do is as important as deciding what to do. And then the late Steve Jobs says, my mantras are focus and simplicity. And it's amazing to me how well this resonates with what we face in the medical device space. And when determining a strategic focus area, obviously we have to make sure that it's something that we're passionate about. If we're not passionate, we're not going to be able to succeed. But it's also important that we take into account the mission, whether it's our own personal mission or the mission of the institution. Maybe we are, working with a particular organization that has a specific objective. Also quite important to look at the strengths and be honest about our own weaknesses and realize, where we can actually have a competitive advantage given the facilities, the equipment, experts, and also the patients that we have access to. For example, if you're in a small city that only has maybe a specific type of a hospital that only has access to a specific type of patient group, maybe we cannot explore other areas that we don't have access to the corresponding patient groups. Also, it's critical, apart from the funding, which is obvious, but also to consider the timing. For example, when it comes to maybe during this pandemic, if you're looking at coming up, with better solutions for respirators, well, you're looking at a 3 months, 6 months timeline. But if I had 10 years, 15 years, maybe I would be, looking at a completely different type of a problem fundamentally with a different objective altogether. And also, it's important to take into account the strategic partnerships that we have in place. So once we have these insights, we can translate them into criteria that can be used to objectively evaluate opportunities and projects. All right. Typically, we can use a weighted multi-criteria decision-making process. So we take these various factors, we score them and grade them, and we use that to ultimately make a decision. And some institutions may actually have like a specific even threshold for each one of these factors. For example, many incubators may say, well, I'm not interested in a market opportunity that's less than 1 billion. We just don't want to touch it. So then you should know that and take that into account. Then once we have that, we sort of go into the next phase of actually exploring the needs. And one step is the first step, but maybe obvious, could be doing actually interviews. And to do this, we have to get out of our comfort zone. That's where the magic happens, right? So and it's not something that, especially for us engineers, it's quite difficult to do so. We're used to staying behind our computers, but we really need to get out there, speak with clinicians, speak with patients, and observe and see what's happening. And it's important to do that with an open mindset, and then ask genuine questions. Don't try to imply answers. Sometimes, especially, it's difficult when we have a solution in mind. We try to seek confirmation. Instead of actually trying to get a genuine perspective and actually, an honest opinion. So we sort of imply answers, and we shouldn't do that. And it's so important to try to ask open-ended questions, not just yes or no questions. Also, don't just rely on what the other party identifies as a pain or need. Often, many times, the biggest opportunities are in problems that are not yet identified as a problem. meaning that they are just ignorant that there is a problem. They haven't seen it, or maybe they're stuck in the flow, or they don't realize it. So you have to come out of that process and think differently. And it takes it takes some courage, but also some different thinking approach to do that. But it's important to do so, to identify maybe problems that are not yet considered as problems by others. When observing a procedure, this is a lesson I learned. When you're going out there to observe procedures, you shouldn't assume that you'll go there and learn when you're observing the procedure. And I didn't have Drake to teach me at that time, but you really want to go and educate yourself in advance about the disease state, treatment options, stakeholders, and a lot of this information is available to you in advance. And because if you don't do so, you may be using very valuable time for something that you could have easily gotten off YouTube. It's important that you use that time very efficiently when you're observing the procedure, to get information that would have not otherwise been available to you. And honestly, in my case, it was a very embarrassing situation I was left in. So I don't want to talk about it, but you don't want to go through that process. But it's just important to don't take it for granted. The opportunities that are given to you to observe procedures or speak with individuals, don't take them for granted. There's a lot of resources out there online, and I won't go into the details of these. But just also important to note, like when you look at clinical review papers, when you look at a lot of case studies, there's a lot of information in there. I specifically sometimes look at terms such as procedure time, for example, failure rate, or even literally search, challenge, in the papers, and you'll be surprised you find a lot of good information there. Then when you're observing procedures, you want to look for failures. They contain a lot of good information. And watch out for frustrations. When are people frowning? When are they getting angry? When are they yelling at one another? There's usually an opportunity there. You want to identify the time-consuming activities of the entire procedure. There's a lot of important information there as well. One of the other things that I've personally experienced is if there are procedures or cases where there's dexterous skills and technical experience, that's not necessarily clinical knowledge, but it's just manual skill, and that's leading to better outcome, that usually means there's an opportunity when it comes to procedures. So, and because that doesn't make sense that you would be dependent on somebody's manual skills. Then you want to be aware of biases, your own biases, the clinician biases, patient biases, and stuff, and so forth. And you want to generally do this as a team. So somebody takes notes, the other person is maybe interviewing, the other person is observing, or multiple parties are observing from different angles. You don't want to do this as a one person, task. And then you want to take comprehensive notes about the circumstances, occurrence rates, implications, costs involved, and so forth. The list goes on. Record as much information as possible. And then ultimately, we take all of these we've identified problems, and from those we form hopefully many hundreds of need statements. And generally, we do that in this form that has three criteria, three pillars: the problem, the population, and the outcome. So for example, we say a way to address problem X in population Y with an outcome Z. And you want to be very specific when you do this. For example, to minimize the risk of infection in prosthetic implants, in this case, the population is implied, or to accelerate the recovery of disabled patients with partial nerve damage, or to reduce radiation dose to staff during X-ray guided surgery. Then ultimately, we need to, once we have these many hundreds of need statements, you need to screen them. So to screen them, you need to take all the various factors into account. Well, obviously the disease state is very important. You need to always consult with physicians and see what the impact of this problem is on the patient, what the impact is on the healthcare system as a whole, what are the statistics. And to summarize, you want to just see how significant of a problem this is. Then you want to look at the existing solutions. You want to see where they are used, how they're used, why they're used, what are the pros and cons, and you want to hopefully go beyond that and see who the players are, what is the IP landscape, is it too crowded, is it easy to penetrate? I mean, like, for example, if somebody told me to work on a new suturing device, I would just automatically say no, because, you know, I know I've seen thousands of patents on that front, and I know I'm not innovative enough to come up with something better. So what about the price? What about the regulatory process? How many thousands of patients do they need to go through regulatory, or was it maybe 10 subjects, and so forth? Is it single use, multi-use? What were the features of the customers? Those are very important things to take note of. So then we want to look at the stakeholders. Any sort of a problem would have specific benefits and costs to various stakeholders, and we should identify those and analyze that. So among these, you know, the patients, physicians, and staff, and government, and institutions and hospitals stand out. So I'll try to skim through these at a high level, but because of time. But obviously, physicians are very important. You need to make sure to speak with as many physicians as you can. Obviously, it's important to speak with experienced and key opinion leaders and key decision makers, but it's also important to speak with less experienced folks because they have a different perspective. And you should try to see whether ultimately this is something they're willing to advocate for, or actually start using, and actually, or maybe if they have a private practice, are they willing to pay for? So those are ultimately, and you can get a sense of how keen they are by seeing whether they're, for example, keen on collaboration, or whether they want to participate in the trials of the study, or, you know, whether they have come up with ideas, or maybe they even want to invest. So those all give you clues and hints of how attractive your idea is to them. The other stakeholders are the staff, which you should not ignore. The nurses and the staff can have major influence. So, for example, does it increase their responsibilities or reduce it? You don't want to have a device or system or solution that each time it's being used, you have folks nagging in the background. Oh, here we go again, for example. You know what I mean? So it's important to take them into account. Are they unionized or not? Like that you may have a customer there. If they're unionized, then maybe you're advocating for their benefits. You can actually get them to champion it. And you want to ultimately see how it affects them. And obviously the patients. You have to see whether they're a decision maker, what their alternative options are, would they be willing to pay for it, what the demographic statistics are, can they provide feedback, quantitative feedback that you can leverage or not. The hospitals themselves, apart from the type and location of the hospital, and who makes the decisions and how they make the decisions. One key finding that I've had is to know or see who your competition is, and do they have existing deals in place with these major potential customers? Because if you have a device, for example, and you're competing head on with a major player that has multiple other contracts with the hospital, you may not be able to penetrate in that sector for those hospitals. And obviously the insurance, you want to make sure you have a reimbursement code in place, or they're willing to promote it. Does it help reduce their costs or the number of claims and so forth? So I'm just going to skim over these for the sake of time. Government is also very important. One key thing is, depending on their policy, you could have many non-dilutive grant opportunities, like during this pandemic era, like, anything you have on the COVID front, for example, maybe you have extra support from the government and in terms of funding, and also just support in general. And ultimately, but not last and not least, is the market size, right? And it's not so easy to always get accurate market data, but you can get an estimate of the market size, and there are many resources. Typically, you can start off with the number of patients or procedures and look at the cost per patient or procedure, or the existing insurance codes and their reimbursement amounts. But you can also do a top-down approach instead of this bottom-up approach, and look at the general market size and try to go the other way around. But these two sides should ultimately meet and match. And then, or you may not even have an exact amount on the market size, but you could price it based on the value you potentially add to the system. And then you have to take into account the cost of R&D, the cost of IP, the cost of trials, and the cost of manufacturing, and so forth, when you're making that sort of ultimate market decision. And ultimately, you do a systematic approach for the need selection. Once you have these hundreds of needs with these various factors, and this is taken from the biodesign book, so you start ranking them in a very systematic way. So for example, what is the impact on the patient? What is the estimated market size? And you score it. Are we passionate about this or no? So, you know, personal favorites, for example. One very important thing is this feasibility index. Is it at all feasible? Or, I mean, you have to know in the timeline that you have, based on your experience and engineering know-how, is this a feasible task? Or is it too much of an R&D project? And I see this is a thing that often engineers, because they love solving problems, they get stuck on this. They go after things that are not actually feasible in a reasonable amount of time. You have to know engineering-wise that there are no major R&D tasks, and you can actually achieve this. And then systematically sort them, and through multiple steps, you can identify the best needs that you go after, and you generate a solution. You identify the root cause of that problem that has led to that need, and you generate the solution and invent. And I'll finish off with this quote: "I've never made one of my discoveries through the process of rational thinking." Albert Einstein. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tavallaey. Very insightful and eye-opening talk about the process of needs finding and value exploration in healthcare. A quick reminder to our audience that we will be addressing your questions at the end of the session. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, you can post them in the chat, in the Zoom chat. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Abu Bakr Khalifa. Dr. Khalifa is an assistant clinical professor with McMaster University and an intensivist at the Joseph Brandt Hospital. He completed biomedical innovation and biodesign fellowship at the Stanford Biodesign Program at the Stanford Bayer Center for Biodesign. He's also the medical director at the NXT Biomedical Incubator in Irvine, California, which is funded with over $200 million to deliver innovative breakthrough medical technologies in largely unmet clinical need areas. Abu Bakr is also a co-founder of an image-based diagnostic company and consults for various medtech startups. He's also involved in various education programs around medtech innovation at McMaster University. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Khalifa.
Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, we're good. Awesome. All right, we'll go through this. Let me just look at the time so I don't go over. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I'm really glad that I'm here with you guys, sharing some insights that I learned and learning through the process around innovation. So I'm going to just very quickly highlight and I'll put some further color to a lot of the fundamental points that Ali brought forward earlier and talked about the needs finding exploration process. And I want to build on these points to further understand how we can further apply it to our own settings, understanding that many from the audience come from various settings. Whenever we talk about startups, it's very often that startups are kind of seen in going up in a straight path, particularly when they're presented in newsletters. You always see, they were able to secure IP, they were able to raise seed funding and then Series A. And as an external person reading about a startup, you're always looking at these type of endpoints, assuming that the direction is more going from point A to point B. But what I want to really emphasize is really the chaos and the confusion and the back and forth that happens in the very early stages before these newsletters come out and the clapping audience comes out for all the achievements that the startup has achieved. And this is really the confusing, chaotic, needs-based innovation process that I want to highlight further. And one thing I want to focus on when we look at this chaos and this confusion, a lot of the principles, and I'm biased because I come from the school of thought of Stanford Biodesign, where it's all about understanding the unmet need and from there start developing solution, is how do I organize this chaos using a particular methodology and trying to put a little bit more of a framework towards innovation, needs-based or early-based innovation. So this is kind of the main principles that we look at the particular stages around identify. And this is the identify phase is really the purpose of this whole seminar, looking at needs finding. And then comes the invention phase and comes the business strategy phase. And I'm going to leave the next two phases aside, but most of this chaos and most of this ups and downs is in the first phase of identifying the unmet need. And it is essential to focus in understanding the unmet need. When we're gonna focus on that for a second here. I think at this time, when we talk about needs-based innovation, we're kind of always battling with the idea of there's so many new technologies out there that have applications towards unmet needs. For example, many people talk about data analysis, big data, machine learning, and I'm sure many experts in machine learning hate when people say, I want to have machine learning in X amount, in X specialty. It's just always simplifying the overall technology. And I think what I want to get to here is there's so many wearable technologies, and everyone talks about these technologies, and there's always a push to push this technology towards the unmet need that you haven't really flushed out. And that's one way of doing it. It doesn't mean it doesn't work, but what I am going to emphasize and what Ali and Joseph is going to emphasize is if we take it the other way, whereas the need pull methodology of let's really flush out the problem, because it might be you might go back and decide that AI or an ML algorithm or a software or a wearable might end up being the technology, but you will figure out important nuances and important critical aspects of the stakeholder meetings that you have that makes it essential to allow for reimbursement for your device. So you can build your technology based on all the analysis you do from the unmet needs. So not only is this more efficient, but it will save you a lot of money and a lot of time in how you organize your needs finding process. And when we look at this needs finding process, Ali did speak about the strategic focus, needs exploration, needs state development, and many physicians on board will have very good understanding around the disease state fundamentals and understand really what the real problem is. But I encourage everyone when we're looking at unmet needs, particularly non-clinicians, to really go to the exploration phase. Because I really can't agree more with Ali's point about you really want to go in the OR and figure out and pick up these frustrations that sometimes clinicians don't really focus on because it's, we just do it that way. And it's just, I'm good at the way I do things. So I do it that way and that's fine. That's not the issue. I want you to focus on that issue is what a clinician might move you towards, but really go back to understand what these frustrations are, because you might notice a pattern between different clinicians and you might notice this area of interest that could be an area of development or an area for innovation. Understanding the existing solutions genuinely, looking at the different areas and not really starting with, I'm sure I can get something better. Let's really delve down and understand, do other solutions out there actually support or answer the need or not? All right. Ali brought up the idea of sutures, and that's important. If sutures that are already created on the different sutures that are available with the busy IP landscape, maybe if it's not the right solution, then we should just put that aside and move to the next solution, move towards the other needs that we might find interesting. So this is the process and around the needs exploration. Ali did speak a lot about it, but I want to emphasize, how do we distill this need? How do I understand the need, discuss it in my group, present it? And this is the point of the need statement, that really what Paul Yock, one of my mentors, talks about and emphasizes is a solution agnostic need statement. Let's really delve down into writing the problem and understanding the problem without putting a solution in there. And understanding the population. So if we're going to focus on the heart failure patient population as a population you want to innovate on, that's just not sufficient. Let's talk about, is it the inpatient heart failure patient? Is it the patients with heart failure that have a particular, that are in the ICU? Or are they the ones that are in the clinic? And you do all that up and down and understanding and really nailing the population that you feel like where is the biggest unmet need. And the other important point is the outcome. And one thing I want to emphasize, and I'm going to emphasize it with this example here, is a way as an example of needs, a way to accurately volume offload. And here, notice I didn't say, use medications to offload volume. I'm not putting any solutions in here. Very important to just put it in high principle. What is the problem? And the focus of the patient population that in this need statement you feel is where the biggest need is diuretic resistant heart failure patients. And when you delve deeper, and I'll tell you right now for non-clinicians, this is a specific group of heart failure patients under the umbrella of heart failure. When you do your research now, when you realize the market in this group is not that big perhaps, then you can go up and say, okay, I'm not gonna focus just on diuretic resistant, I'm gonna focus on inpatient heart failure patients. So this type of going up and down in your need statement, you will refine it with the research you do around stakeholder analysis and market analysis to hone down where your project is going to lie. And the last point that I really want to emphasize is the outcome here. That, it seems like a very easy task to do and writing a need statement. But the outcome has to be not an outcome that, we all want devices that save lives, that reduce hospital stay. But we need to put a little bit of research to understand that these outcomes that we put in these need statements, number one, have to be quantifiable. So when I do a feasibility research study to analyze my innovation, I have particular standards to say, I can quantify quality of life, reduce hospitalizations by particular scores, for example. And the other important point is these outcomes have to be outcomes that are well accepted by heart failure society, by how the doctors understand. If quality of life and reduced hospitalizations is not relevant for this patient population from the way that the heart failure society sees it, then it should not be an outcome here. If the more relevant outcome is on mortality, and that should be the focus, and that's what you're hearing from the cardiologists and the heart failure doctors, you have to put the outcome that is more relevant to the society you're working in. And different fields have different thresholds towards these outcomes. ENT has different thresholds. Ophthalmology has different thresholds, and cardiology has different thresholds. So I wanted to emphasize a little bit on this slide because it is a key point towards really nailing down the problem, but also taking the research to the next level. It becomes kind of like your thesis statement. And one thing I say is, with your observations, observe throughout the journey of the patients, whether it's the hospital or the clinic, you will have many observations. And then from there, you filter. You filter based on number of patients in this population. And then when you narrow down the population, does it go down? Does it affect the market? What is the burden of proof needed in this space? Do I need to do a study on 300 patients or 10 patients? All of this is incredibly relevant early on because it gives you an idea of what your innovation, what all this chaos and confusion we talked about earlier, what will it look like in milestones so that you're objective in your fundraising and objective in your product development. I want to highlight one important example around stakeholder analysis. And this is something that has been discussed for years about, Uber for healthcare and taking aspects from the tech world and putting it into the med tech or health tech world is bringing something like Uber where, in the tech world, a difference is the customer and the payer are usually very defined, right? There's someone who's the customer who's gonna hail for a ride, and there's also a payer, and you have the business is gonna be the driver, and you're gonna pay the driver. But when it comes to healthcare, we have to be a little bit more cautious with taking principle in the tech world to the med tech world, because there's a little bit of a battle of stakeholders here. In fact, a critical battle of stakeholders here. You have, number one, you have clinicians who have specific goals towards patient outcomes. We have hospital administrators that have particular limitations when it comes to buying equipment for physicians, because these physicians, most of the time as clinicians, we're not going to pay from our own pocket. We're gonna have to convince hospitals to pay for it. And the hospitals will be convinced if insurance companies or reimbursement in Canada is going to reimburse it. So you have really different heads in one dragon here, where you have a buyer that's not the payer, and you have a customer who's not necessarily going to benefit from it because the patient is benefiting from it. So there's so many components to this stakeholder analysis, the deeper you analyze this in the needs finding space, you will understand who is the stakeholder that is most affected, hence the stakeholder that will most likely pay for your equipment or pay for your solution that you bring forward. So many people focus on this later on when they talk about commercialization. What I'm telling you guys, take it, pull it back towards the early needs finding process, and it will really help you build a story for commercialization to even get early fundraising. I'm going to end this with 2 case studies. One of them is, this is a group out of the Stanford Biodesign program where an engineer and a physician went to the ICU department, and they noticed that many patients were on IV medications, intravenous sedation medications, whenever they get agitated and when they are on ventilators and machines for breathing. So the engineer asked in this situation that, why are we making patients more sedated because they get really agitated from the machine and the ventilator, and it becomes more like a vicious cycle that every time you want to wake up a patient, get him off the ventilator, if they get really agitated, you give them medication to make them sleep and comfortable, and you try again the next day. So one of the thoughts of the engineer was, is there a way that we don't use IV sedation? If the problem is getting him off the ventilator and the need is to extubate sooner, then perhaps we have to think about different ways to get them comfortable and get them off the machine. So they defined this problem and they designed the solution without using IV medication. Basically, it's this narrow catheter that goes around the vocal cords and infuses some numbing medication around there, and without using IV sedation. What did that do? That reduced delirium, confusion in the hospital, in the ICU, that reduced the ventilator dependent days. And this solution, when developed in a very short period, got acquired by Cook Medical because of one fundamental point when I talked to the founders of this company, is they really focused on the need, and they spent hours and hours in the ICU trying to wrap their head around this problem. So I just wanted to emphasize the importance of it needs exploration, because it will allow you to think about very unique solutions that me as an ICU clinician, I wouldn't have even thought about without that type of collaborative work. The second area I want to work on is talk about is a case study on OcuLeave. 18 million patients suffer from dry eye disease. Michael Ackerman, who is also a biodesign alumni, delved into the unmet need and noticed that most people use eye drops, and these eye drops don't necessarily help the patients. And when you delved further into the unmet need and realized that the glands, once they are activated and neurostimulated, then they will release more tears. And by delving further into the need, he understood that maybe there's another mechanism of action towards focusing on here. And one of the solutions that came up only after delving deep into the mechanism of action is, let's create an implant into the lacrimal gland to create further tears, and hence perhaps the patient's dry eyes are going to get better. They did the animal studies. And when they did the animal studies, this particular implant migrated, and this was considered an adverse effect, migrated towards the nose. And although it migrated close to the nose, they noticed that the tear production was similar to when it was implanted directly on the gland. So what did that lead to? They said, perhaps we're going to create a neurostimulator that goes into the nose, and then you move from an implant that's expensive, that would require significant reimbursement challenges, that would have a lot of implications with an OR time, to put an implant for a problem that's usually solved as an outpatient, and shifted towards a neurostimulation device that you put into your nose a few times a day to create more tears. And in this experiment, in this case study, we ask ourselves, where did it go from here? Allergan acquired OcuLeave for dry eye disease for almost $125 million in the early phases, before even human studies came into effect for this device. And when you really go back to this story, you notice that there was a focus in the unmet need and the mechanism of action, or else they would have innovated on how can we allow for more optimized teardrops and work around there. They really delve deeper into the unmet need. So this is important to highlight these two case studies on how the focus on needs finding can make your process a lot more effective and efficient. So my summary points, because I think I went over my time, is to fall in love with the problem and the unmet need and delve deeper into it. Even if you come in with a little bit, and we all have that, this bug inside of us to innovate and come up with solutions, that will adapt with your process. Make sure you go in depth with the comprehensive analysis on the unmet needs, or looking at stakeholders, looking at the mechanism of action, and exploring needs from different stakeholders, because this mapping of the stakeholders is going to be a critical piece to this, as it allows you to know where is the highest value, which stakeholder considers enough value that they would pay for something for your particular solution, or would pay for your unmet need area of development. And thank you very much.